Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy, I'm a writer, and this is an educational YouTube series intended to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversation with other writers. Emily Zarka earned her doctorate in literature from Arizona State University, where she currently serves as an instructor in the English department. She is a public scholar and digital educator with expertise in the Gothic genre, horror, and monsters in literature and film. Zarka is writer and host of the popular YouTube series Monstrum, the flagship show on PBS's storied humanities channel. Since its launch in 2019, Monstrum has won multiple Telly Awards and was a 2022 Webby honoree in Best Video Writing. Zarka served as host of the Rhetoric and Composition video series at ASU's groundbreaking study hall project, and her Audible original lecture series, Serial Killers Real and Imagined, launched earlier this month. And this is my conversation with Dr. Zarka. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm hanging in there. So what are you working on now, and what motivated the project?
So right now, of course, as always, I'm working on Monstrum, but I'm also working on revising my academic monograph for a more public audience. And then I'm currently also in proposal stages for an illustrated tabletop book that would look at different undead creatures from across the globe.
That sounds wonderful. I love the Monstrum series. Can you give us any details about what's coming on that?
Yes, absolutely. We are into season 6 right now, which is absolutely crazy. I've lost count of how many episodes we've done, quite frankly, and I research and write every single one, and it's one of my absolute favorite parts about my work with PBS and my work as a public scholar is I get to really dig into all these cultures and histories that I wasn't aware of. And that's something that I just get a lot of joy at as a scholar. So what we have coming up for Monstrum is we've already recorded and filmed. We just released our Caddy or Cadborosaurus episode yesterday, all about modern sea serpents. We have a King Kong Part 2 episode coming out as well. And then I will be diving into a digital folklore sort of space, literally, called The Backrooms. And that one was really fun to write because I got to sort of put on more of my traditional academic hat and talk about things like liminal spaces and uncanniness. And whenever my sort of interests overlap, I always get a lot of excitement from that.
And for your monograph, you said you're revising it for a public audience. What's different about writing for a public audience as opposed to a scholarly audience? How do you navigate that?
It's a really good question. And I'm not saying that I'm mastered it by any means. I think that it kind of depends on the audience. So even when writing for YouTube, which is an international audience of millions, that I have to sort of parcel down a lot of maybe more complex ideas. And I don't get to sort of name drop maybe some of the scholars or academics that I would like to, just because that's not the style for YouTube as a whole. But for something like revising my academic monograph, it's less about the jargon. I think that we as academics and scholarship, because most of us have been trained this way, right, is we want to get into the theory and we want to discuss every single facet of our critical reading, or we want to, at least I'm guilty of this, go on a tangent, about the author's life in this capacity. And with a public audience, you have to keep in mind that I don't dumb down anything. I do believe that people want to learn. And I think that not serving them properly as an academic and a scholar is a disservice to them in a lot of ways. So I do incorporate a lot of footnotes. I'm guilty of a good footnote. That's one of my actually weird, quirky writing things. So a lot of, citations and traditional stuff is still going to be present in this book, but it's about making things as simple as possible and taking out a lot of that sort of not eloquent, but excessively elaborate language. I think that scholars are maybe used to seeing in certain types of books that maybe we would teach in the classroom. But what I'm working on now would be for the general public. So it's about simplifying as much as you can without losing the material. So definitely a challenge, but something that I'm enjoying so far.
And the last thing you mentioned was the illustrated book.
Yes.
Who's the audience for that?
The audience for that is lovers of all things spooky and macabre. My person I'm working with right now is Jesse Larson. He's an absolutely incredible illustrator. And he reached out to me actually years ago when Monstrum was still in its very nascent stages. And then, of course, COVID happened and life happened, and I had a baby. And, it kind of got put on the back burner, but it's something that I'm so passionate about. And his work is so incredible. So that audience would, again, just be a more general public. We're going for probably like 15 and up, because some of the stuff is going to be spooky and a little bit darker, but we want to make like a modern day bestiary for the undead. So we're going to have Jesse's incredible illustrations, and we work hand in hand with me giving some historical references and sort of speaking about the monster in a certain way, and then he gives his interpretation, and it's a collaboration for sure. So each entry in this book will have the historical information, the sort of my, of course, take on why this creature might have come into existence. And then we're going to have how to defeat it and little excerpts from, some of the older texts or original folklore texts that maybe people aren't as familiar with. Like everyone knows Dracula. Of course, we're going to have, that type of vampire, but let's give you maybe, the excerpt from the early 18th century text that really started sort of the European vampire craze.
I can't wait to check it all out. And congratulations on the new baby.
Thank you. Yeah. My son is over a year old and walking and crazy like a madman in so many delightful ways. And of course, he has a cute monster, themed room. And he so far likes spooky things. So we're just going to keep running with that.
So, what have you learned about yourself through scholarly writing and research processes?
I think that what I've learned the most about myself researching and writing coming out of the PhD program, I think that that's such a very insular, honestly, sort of like isolating thing, at least the kind of research that I do and how I like to work. I had a great committee, but I'm better with my own deadlines. And I kind of go into what I call like my writing hobble, and I will let honestly hours pass, which is bad. Without, getting up and without drinking anything but like maybe coffee or tea. And then all the time passes. And I think that one really cool thing I've learned in doing more public facing work in public scholarship is that I can't be that insular in my writing and my research. So I've become a lot less precious about my writing, because my work with my production team, Spotson, through PBS, we table read, every script at least 2 times. And we go through probably 1 or 2 edits to the script even before doing that. And, that's why I teach peer review, right? As well, is they get to really sort of be like, this doesn't make sense, or I don't think this is flowing. Maybe let's restructure the entire thing. So I think that this is where something even in like the more academic realm of having like a writing group or a cohort or someone who's not even in your specialty, or maybe not even in like your department, to look at your work and see, what holes are there and what things aren't making sense. Because as I always like, we know the connection. We know how we're trying to get from point A to point B, but it's actually explaining that connection. That's the hard part. So the more eyes you can get on something, the better. So I think that's translated outside of my work with PBS as well, for things like getting, readers' reviews back. I feel less insulted maybe, or less upset about those things than I would have, I think, previously, or certainly at what I would have as a PhD student, because, it's like a shoulder shrug, and it's like, okay, some good points, some things I don't agree with, but, thanks for the feedback. And trying to adopt that mentality, I think, is something that someone who I review, journal articles and manuscripts as well. And I always try to remember that, like, I'm just trying to help this person. And that's ideally what a good reviewer or collaborator should be doing, is helping you make the best material possible.
What's the role or responsibility of scholarship or scholarly writing for you? What keeps you generating material? Why do scholarship? Why write?
I think that just my general pedagogy as an educator is, I believe that the more voices we have contributing to conversations in the world, potentially the better the world could be. And I think that we need to always be respectful of all those conversations that are happening at once. So I think part of my responsibility as an academic is diving as deep into something as I can and pulling my information from as many sources as possible. And this is particularly important for me when I'm dealing with monsters on Monstrum that, art from cultures or heritages that I'm a part of. I want to make sure that the academic scholarship I'm relying on, or, the first sources that I'm looking at aren't just from one type of person. Sometimes that requires bringing in an outside expert, or sometimes that requires, paying someone for a translation of a text that I can't read in like the native language. And I think that putting that additional effort is something that all scholarship can do. My more traditional academic work, and what sort of got me started this journey, I look at female voices in Gothic literature. And talking about female voices to me is really important, and marginalized voices in general. And I think that when, as a scholar and as a professor, I need to point out the flaws also maybe in the sources that I'm relying on. And let's just not talk about, the parts of this monster, the parts of this book or this narrative that we really like. Let's talk about the weird, sticky stuff too. And maybe, why this author's approach to this, character text might be coming out the way that it is. So I think having difficult conversations is something that is really important as a scholar. And I think part of my job as an educator is creating that safe space for my students. If that's in a physical classroom or a virtual classroom, or if that's on YouTube, I do think that the people who watch Monstrum, I consider them students. And pointing out the things that people don't want to talk about, sometimes that backfires a little bit. That happened recently with our King Kong Part 1 episode, and just talking about the inherent racism that was not just apparent in that film, but in Hollywood as a whole at the time. Some people push back against that, and they're like, stop making, these pop culture texts, about race or about sexuality or about colonialism and all these things. And I think that I'd be a disservice to the audience who does want to actually learn, and the students who want to have a more wide understanding of the world around us, by leaving those things out. So I think, again, having the difficult conversations with yourself, with your students, and just making sure that you are also acknowledging maybe your own prejudices and biases coming into a text can also be very helpful.
And you're completely right. It's important to double check all of these things and then navigate and work through and talk about those discrepancies within text, because not only do we have our own personal bias, we also have cultural context, we also have history playing on this, and then even our contemporary situation plays a factor in this too.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said double checking. I mean, again, this is something that seems really basic, but you have, especially if it's such an important point. So for instance, when I was editing or researching the Caposaurus episode, I had like one of those gut like head tilt moments. Like there was an academic peer-reviewed source that was citing like, oh, the first newspaper article was in this state at this particular date. And instead of just like relying on that, I went to go try to find that source and couldn't, and actually found an earlier source. And like, people make mistakes. I get it. I've done it in my own research. It happens all the time. We do have a fact checker for PBS, which is fantastic because, again, we're human. We make mistakes. And I don't shame anyone. Like, I'm not going to call out that person for, citing the wrong date, because sometimes maybe that newspaper article wasn't accessible to them at the time for whatever reason. So, but pointing out the correct dates of things and making sure that we are fact checking our work when we do find those mistakes, I think part of our responsibility as scholars is to fix them. And again, as a reviewer, when I come across this, I want to try to do it as respectfully and kindly and as possible. Because I think as academics, we've all had, reader B, or the second reader is always the one where you're like, why am I doing this? And I just don't think that's helpful. I really don't. And I hope that academia as a whole is becoming a more inclusive place. I know we're by no means at the end of that journey, but I would hope that younger generations of scholars are approaching scholarship and helping one another rather than trying to compete with one another with research.
When you're struggling in research or writing for whatever reason, what strategies do you use to get yourself back to the page?
I'm a creature of habit, and I'm also a very sensory person. So I have a particular room that I prefer to write in. I have, my background noise that'll play. I can't do music. That's too distracting for me. So I will actually have, a separate YouTube video pulled up that's like rain or something just like natural and peaceful to kind of distract me from some of the noise in my own head. And I have like certain mugs that I use. I have like a certain candle that I only light when I'm really trying to write. And I don't do that when I'm researching. I just do that when I'm like in, the writing phase. So I think creating a space, whatever that space looks like, and having those sensory cues can help you sort of get motivated. The other thing that really helps me when I come across a roadblock, two other things. One is research something totally different. If I'm, struggling with a certain chapter or a certain monster, and like right now I'm researching two monsters and I wasn't feeling particularly inspired by one of them yet to write the script. I'd done the research, but I was like, I'm not in the mood yet. So I'm like, cool, let's just completely research this other entire new episode. And so I can come back with it at fresh eyes. And I think that brings me to my second point, which is take a break. I think, again, maybe this is just me, but being so insular and solitary in a lot of ways, or at least in the past with my writing, I was always the person who's like, I have to get this deadline. I have to turn in this chapter on time. I have to get it done. And someone once told me, they're like, when have you ever not gotten it done? And I couldn't think of an example to tell them. And then it was like, go, watch the movie, go have a meal with your friends. Like, you're going to get the work done. If you need to ask for an extension, ask for the extension. I've certainly done that as well. But I think, even as someone who deeply loves reading and researching and writing, I have to remind myself that that can't be my entire world. I think that would be a disservice to myself, but also a disservice to my students. Because again, if my pedagogy is about approaching research and scholarship from getting as many voices as possible into something, I have to be exposing my own self to those voices in the real world, not just on the page.
That's a really important point, that we do need to take breaks, and many of us very much struggle to do so. So do you have any strategies for helping you to remember to take a break?
Absolutely. I will set a timer or I've done that before, like a certain amount of time before I take a break. I also will be like, okay, I'm guilty like of having, like 20 different tabs open on my browser of like all the different articles and books that I want to be reading. And I'm like, okay, you can only do like 2 of these. I wouldn't recommend this, but having a baby who takes naps, I've been forced to like have less time, frankly, trying to get my work done. So being a little more organized, trying to get rid of distractions. So for me, sometimes that's, putting my phone in the other room. So then when I do want to take a break, I can engage with the people and the things that I want to. Also, I think my big piece of advice would be like, try not to lose contact with people, which I'm really guilty of doing. But, if someone asks you for like dinner plans 2 weeks down the road, say yes, even if you don't feel like in that moment that you want to do it, because you're probably going to want to when that comes and when, you're kind of out of your headspace at that one time. So I would say yes to the things that will serve you better and no to the things that are just going to add additional pressure.
What's your favorite part of the writing or the research process, and why?
I absolutely love finding those weird, fun facts and like things when I can be surprised in my own research. That's when I get super, super excited about something. And I'm very guilty of falling into those research, sinkholes where all of a sudden someone makes a footnote mention about like what the flesh of mummy tastes like. And I'm like, that's super bizarre. And then I go into like their life and why that was a thing. And I do though find those avenues so exciting. And that's what honestly got me started as a public scholar is I was researching female Gothic literature and representations of the undead. And as I started reading more and more about that, I was exposed to different voices and different cultures and different monsters. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity that I was able to spin that into a career. And this point is essentially, I just am a huge nerd for fun facts, and I get to do that for a living. So I truly find the most joy in the research process, especially with those primary resources and being, making those connections, I think is just super fun and exciting. So for instance, there was a monster that I was doing, I can't remember which, we had like we joked that last season was like the accidental horse season of Monstrum. We had these like horse monsters for whatever reason. And I found a connection between representations of one type of monster based on different parts of the country that I believe are connected to like the leather trade, what type of leather was, being produced in those areas. And that I was researching things that were completely separate from what I thought I would be doing. And that's what keeps me interested. And that's what keeps me wanting to learn. And I'm sure there are many people who watch the show who would agree with that. We certainly don't become educators for the money. We do it because we love learning. And I'm just so grateful that I get to learn from so many different sources and truly from my students. And again, even my YouTube students I read every single comment that's posted on every single video, which other YouTube educators think I'm crazy for doing, but I want to hear those voices. And hopefully I can create that, a safe space on the internet, as hard as that is to do, for people to be able to chime in about their own responses to some of the research that I'm doing.
So what revision strategy or strategies do you find most useful when revising your own work, and why? What problems or challenges do these activities help you solve?
I think the biggest tip I can give is besides take a break and come back to it, is read your work out loud. I think first, it feels very bizarre, maybe, because you're essentially talking to yourself. But to me, I try to write to a degree in my own voice. And I know that there's been scientific studies that have been done that our brain processes information differently, auditorially versus visually. So I just consider it as like another method of the writing process is I'll sometimes talk to myself while I'm writing, then I take a break and go back and I will read everything from top to bottom. I also revision process wise, I like to start with like introduction. I like to start at the beginning, not the middle or the end, which definitely has its own set of challenges because it a lot of time means I have to have all my research done or as much of it as I can. But I think trying to explain the introduction of something is the most challenging part. And that helps me figure out how the rest of the script or the chapter needs to go. I treat it as sort of like an outline, I guess, for the rest of the text that I'm writing. So it's hard. And again, you just choose a writing process that works for you and it works for me. The other thing that I do in the revision process that I've started since my work with Monstrum is writing in chunks as I'm doing the research. And that's, again, a little bit easier for something that's more public facing just because of the genre. But I will not just like paraphrase or take my quotations and make my citations. I'm doing all those things, of course, but I will write little like chunks of the script of how I think I'm going to want to talk about this thing. And then I will make an outline of how I think I want the episode to flow. And I will literally copy and paste from one document to the other. And I kind of already have chunks of things. So it's more about, writing transitions and making sure the flow is working rather than focusing on the nitty gritty. So for me, the revision process happens actually during the research process. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
What reading suggestions do you have? What scholars or writers do you keep in your back pocket and why?
The person I always will give shout out to indefinitely because she is a colleague and a mentor and someone I deeply admire is Devaney Loser. She's incredible. She's a Jane Austen scholar who does a lot of public scholarship. And she was on my dissertation committee and, helped me get started on this journey. Her work is incredibly accessible and fun to read. So definitely check her out. I'm also a fan of Haley Rubenhold, who does, again, a lot of historical work. She wrote a book called The Five, which was about the victims of the Jack the Ripper killer or killers. And just actually giving those women's lives outside of their deaths, some meaning and some context. I admire that. In terms of creative fiction, I always recommend Stephen Graham Jones as a horror author. He's an incredible author, an incredible professor. I had the pleasure of having him as one of my teachers back at University of Colorado, and his work has just become even more prolific and skyrocketed since then. So check out his stuff for sure. He has a great slasher series out right now, but if you haven't read The Only Good Indians, that would be probably my top number one suggestion from him.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to check out all those reading suggestions. I've learned so much, and thank you for making time for me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.